Hello family, welcome to Jimmy Stories. Please do remember to subscribe, like, leave your thoughts on the comments section, and also share this video. It means the world to us. Thank you as you do so. Now sit back and relax as we dive into this thrilling story briefly. Emma stood on the steps of the courthouse, her hands trembling as she clutched her lawyer's arm for support. The January morning was cold, the chill seeping through her thin coat, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. This was it, the day she had dreaded yet prepared for. She glanced down at the small notebook in her other hand, a list of reminders and reassurances she had written the night before. Stay calm. Speak the truth. Remember Noah and Sophia need you. Emma, are you ready? Her lawyer, Mr. Adewale, asked gently, his voice calm and reassuring. He had been by her side for months now, guiding her through the tangled mess Andrew had created. Emma swallowed hard and nodded, though her legs felt weak. I don't know if I'm ready, but I don't have a choice, do I? I can't let him win, Adewale. I just can't. You won't, he said firmly. Remember, you've done everything right. You've been a good mother to those children, and today, we'll show the court the truth. Trust me, Emma. Taking a deep breath, Emma straightened her shoulders and stepped through the large glass doors of the courthouse. Inside, the air was sterile and tense, the sound of heels clicking against the tiled floor echoing around them. Her stomach twisted as they walked toward the courtroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the end of the hallway, she spotted Andrew sitting confidently at a table, just outside the courtroom doors. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his gold wristwatch glinting under the fluorescent lights. His face was calm, even smug, as if he had already won the battle before it began. When his eyes landed on Emma, a smirk curled at the corners of his mouth. Emma, he said, his tone laced with mockery as he leaned back in his chair. I didn't think you'd actually show up. You've always been more of a quitter, haven't you? Emma clenched her fists, willing herself not to react. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let him get under her skin today. She couldn't afford to. I'm here for Noah and Sophia, she replied quietly, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. That's all that matters. Andrew chuckled, the sound low and condescending. You really think you can win this? With what? That part-time job of yours? Or maybe that crumbling apartment you call a home? He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You're nothing without me, Emma. You always have been, and you always will be. Her chest tightened, but she refused to let him see her fear. Before she could respond, Mr. Adewale stepped forward, his expression sharp and unyielding. Mr. Andrew, he said coolly, I suggest you save your theatrics for the courtroom. Today isn't about personal attacks, it's about the children. Andrew snorted, waving a dismissive hand. Of course. Let's get this over with. I have more important things to do than entertain delusions. Emma turned away, gripping Adewale's arm as they entered the courtroom. The space was cold and imposing, with rows of wooden benches and a high judge's bench dominating the room. The opposing sides were separated by two tables, one for Andrew and his team, the other for Emma and hers. As she took her seat, she noticed how Andrew's team, a group of polished, confident lawyers, whispered among themselves, occasionally throwing glances her way. Emma felt small, almost insignificant, in comparison. But then she thought of her children. She thought of Noah's laughter when they played board games on the weekends, of Sophia curling up next to her at night, whispering, I love you, Mommy. Those memories gave her strength. You're going to do fine, Adewale said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Just focus on the facts and remember why you're here. Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. She glanced at the judge's bench, then at the empty seats behind her, where she knew some of her friends would soon be sitting in quiet support. Andrew might have money and connections, but Emma had something far more powerful, the truth. As the bailiff called the court to order, Emma took one last deep breath. Andrew sat across from her, leaning back in his chair with an air of invincibility, but she refused to be intimidated. She might have been nervous and unsure of what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, she wasn't giving up. Not today. Not ever. Emma sat quietly at the table in the courtroom during a brief recess, her hands clasped together, tightly. Across the room, Andrew chatted with his lawyer, his face full of confidence and superiority. It was the same arrogant smirk that had haunted her for years, but this time, Emma was different. She wasn't the same woman Andrew had abandoned. What he didn't know was that beneath her calm exterior lay a woman who had risen from the ashes of her past. As she stared at the papers in front of her, her mind drifted back to the difficult days after the divorce. With nothing but a few belongings, and the responsibility of raising Noah and Sophia, Emma had been pushed to her limits. She remembered the countless nights she cried silently after putting the kids to bed, wondering how she would make ends meet. Those moments had been the darkest of her life. One particular memory stood out. It was the day she met Auntie Beezy, an old family friend she hadn't seen in years. Emma had been sitting outside a small restaurant, waiting for a job interview that she desperately needed. She was dressed in a borrowed blouse and skirt, her shoes scuffed and worn. "Emma," a familiar voice had called out. She looked up to see Auntie Beezy, a lively woman in her 50s, standing in front of her with a warm smile. "Is this you?" Emma had stood, embarrassed by her appearance. "Auntie Beezy, good afternoon," she said quietly, trying to smile. "What are you doing here?" Auntie Beezy asked, her eyes scanning Emma's tired face and worn clothes. I'm looking for work," Emma admitted reluctantly. Auntie Beezy had frowned deeply. "Work? Emma, this is not how I remember you. What happened?" Emma hesitated but eventually poured out her story, how Andrew had left her with nothing, how she had struggled to provide for her children, and how she was barely holding on. Auntie Beezy listened intently, her expression softening with every word. "You don't deserve this," Auntie Beezy said firmly when Emma finished. "Come and see me tomorrow. I think I know how to help you." The next day, Emma met Auntie Beezy at her office, a modest but bustling place filled with energy. That meeting marked the beginning of Emma's transformation. Auntie Beezy introduced her to a network of business opportunities and taught her how to invest wisely. Emma started small, taking on small projects and saving every penny she could. Over time, her efforts grew into something extraordinary. Her first breakthrough came when she invested in a small real estate venture. With Auntie Beezy's guidance, she bought a few properties that quickly appreciated in value. From there, Emma branched out into tech startups and import-export businesses, always staying behind the scenes as a silent partner. By the time 2 years had passed, Emma was no longer the struggling single mother Andrew had left behind. She was a wealthy woman, though she chose to keep her success private. "Emma," Mr. Adewale's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "Are you ready? The next session is about to start." She looked up at her lawyer, her face calm but determined. "Yes, I'm ready," she said quietly. "You know," Mr. Adewale added, leaning closer, "Andrew still thinks he has you cornered. He has no idea what we have prepared." Emma allowed herself a small smile. "Let him underestimate me," she said. "It's what he's always done." Andrew, on the other hand, remained oblivious to Emma's transformation. He sat across the courtroom, laughing with his lawyer and gesturing smugly as if the outcome of the case were already decided. To him, Emma was still the desperate woman he had discarded. He believed his wealth and influence would crush her. Emma's heart burned with determination as she watched him. She thought about everything she had endured, every insult, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. But those struggles had shaped her into the woman she was today. Andrew's arrogance blinded him to the fact that she no longer needed his validation or support. She had built a life of her own, one that no amount of his scheming could take away. As the courtroom doors opened and the judge returned, Emma straightened her posture. She glanced at Andrew one more time, his overconfidence almost laughable now. He truly believed he had already won. But Emma knew the truth, and soon, so would everyone else. Her grip tightened on the edge of the table as she whispered under her breath, this is my fight, and I'm ready." Andrew sat confidently in his chair, his hands resting casually on the table in front of him as his lawyer stood to address the court. The courtroom was silent as the lawyer began painting a grim picture of Emma's life. His voice was smooth, deliberate, and laced with false concern. "Your Honor," he began, pacing slowly, "it is unfortunate that Mrs. Emma Okafor has been unable to provide a stable and secure environment for her children. Financial records show she has struggled to maintain consistent income since the divorce. Her neglectful behavior has created an unstable life for Noah and Sophia, putting their emotional and physical well-being at risk." Emma clenched her hands in her lap, willing herself to remain composed. She refused to let Andrew see her flinch. Across the courtroom, Andrew sat with a smug grin, his eyes fixed on her, as if daring her to fight back. "Your Honor," the lawyer continued, "my client, Mr. Andrew Okafor, has always prioritized the best interests of his children. His financial stability, combined with his deep commitment to their well-being, makes him the obvious choice for primary custody." Emma felt a wave of anger rise within her, but she stayed calm. She knew this was Andrew's game, manipulating the narrative to make her seem like a failure. But she also knew the truth, and she trusted that it would come to light. When Andrew's lawyer finished, Mr. Adewale rose confidently. "Your Honor, while my esteemed colleague has painted a certain picture of Mrs. Okafor, the facts tell a very different story. Let us examine Mr. Okafor's claims more closely." He walked to the center of the courtroom and gestured toward Andrew. "Mr. Okafor claims to be a devoted father, but we have evidence that contradicts his statements. For instance, the so-called financial support he provided was inconsistent and often delayed. Additionally, we have documents proving that Mr. Okafor has fabricated evidence to discredit my client." The courtroom stirred as murmurs filled the air. Emma glanced at Andrew and saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross his face. "Your Honor," Mr. Adewale continued, "we have witnesses who can testify to Mr. Okafor's tactics. For instance, his former employee, who will confirm he was paid to create false records suggesting Mrs. Okafor was irresponsible with her finances." A man sitting near the back of the courtroom stood nervously when called forward. He was a former accountant Andrew had hired, and his testimony was damning. "Mr. Okafor instructed me to alter financial records to make it look like Mrs. Okafor was in debt," he admitted, his voice shaky but clear. Emma felt a rush of vindication as the courtroom buzzed with disbelief. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his once confident smirk now replaced with a hardened glare. The next witness was a housekeeper who had worked for the family during their marriage. Her testimony revealed another side of Andrew, the controlling, manipulative man who had contributed to the collapse of their marriage. "Mr. Okafor was rarely home," the housekeeper said. "He spent most nights out, and when he was home, he was difficult. He often blamed Mrs. Okafor for things that were not her fault. She did her best to hold the family together, but he made it impossible." Emma felt her throat tighten as the memories flooded back. The late nights Andrew spent working, only for her to discover messages from other women on his phone. The constant gaslighting, making her feel as though every argument was her fault. The day she finally confronted him about his infidelity, only for him to laugh in her face and say, "You're lucky to have me. No one else would put up with you." Back in the courtroom, Mr. Adewale's voice broke through her thoughts. "Your Honor, it's clear that Mr. Okafor's accusations are not only baseless, but part of a calculated effort to tarnish Mrs. Okafor's character. My client has done nothing but provide a loving, stable environment for her children, despite the challenges she's faced." Andrew's lawyer attempted to regain control, but the damage was done. The judge looked unimpressed as Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After the session ended, Andrew approached Emma in the hallway. His face was a mix of anger and disdain. "You think you've won something today?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You don't know who you're messing with, Emma. You'll regret standing up to me." Emma met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "I've regretted a lot of things, Andrew," she said quietly. "But fighting for my children will never be one of them." he scoffed, turning on his heel and walking away, but Emma didn't flinch. She stood there, drawing strength from the truth that had been revealed in court. For years, Andrew had underestimated her, but those days were over. The courtroom was tense as Emma's lawyer, Mr. Adewale, stood and addressed the judge. His calm demeanor carried an air of authority that demanded attention. He flipped through a folder of documents before stepping forward, his voice steady and clear. Your Honor, today we will present evidence that not only refutes Mr. Okafor's claims, but also sheds light on his behavior toward his family, behavior that has caused significant harm to both Mrs. Okafor and their children. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his trademark smirk in place, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Emma noticed it, and for the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. Mr. Adewale called the first witness to the stand, the family's former housekeeper. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm voice, she walked confidently to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. Please state your name for the record, Mr. Adewale began. My name is Mrs. Grace Akintola, the woman replied. Mrs. Akintola, how long did you work for the Okafor family? He asked. I worked for them for about 5 years, until the time of their divorce, she said. And during your time with the family, what did you observe about Mr. Okafor's behavior toward his wife and children? Mrs. Akintola hesitated for a moment, glancing briefly at Andrew before speaking. Mr. Okafor was distant, she said carefully. He was rarely home, and when he was, he didn't spend much time with the children. He often left Mrs. Okafor to handle everything, caring for the children, managing the house, everything. Did you ever witness behavior from Mr. Okafor that you would consider abusive? Mr. Adewale pressed. Mrs. Akintola nodded slowly. Yes. He would often yell at Mrs. Okafor over small things, blaming her for things that weren't her fault. It was like he wanted to make her feel small. The children saw this too, and it affected them. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smirk replaced with a clenched jaw. Emma kept her gaze fixed on Mrs. Akintola, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Can you describe how the children reacted to Mr. Okafor's behavior? Mr. Adewale asked. Mrs. Akintola's voice softened. They were always nervous when he was around. Noah, especially, would cling to his mother whenever Mr. Okafor was home. And Sophia, she would cry sometimes, saying she didn't want Daddy to yell at Mommy anymore. The courtroom fell silent for a moment as the weight of her words sank in. Emma felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to stay composed. Thank you, Mrs. Akintola, Mr. Adewale said, nodding at her. No further questions. As Mrs. Akintola left the stand, Emma glanced at Andrew. His confident demeanor was starting to crack, but he still refused to meet her eyes. The next moment was the most emotional part of the day. Noah and Sophia were brought into the courtroom to speak with the judge in a private session. Though Emma couldn't hear what they were saying, she saw the way her children's faces lit up when they looked at her. They smiled shyly, their small hands clutching each other for support as they answered the judge's questions. When they returned to their seats, Noah whispered, "We told the judge we want to stay with you, Mommy." Emma blinked back tears and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, my love. You did so well," she whispered. The judge then asked both lawyers to make their final remarks for the day. Andrew's lawyer spoke first, reiterating claims about Emma's supposed instability. But the words felt hollow now, and even Andrew seemed less certain of himself. When it was Mr. Adewale's turn, he stood tall and addressed the court. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Mrs. Okafor has proven to be a devoted mother who has done everything in her power to provide a safe and loving home for her children. Meanwhile, Mr. Okafor's actions have shown a pattern of neglect and manipulation. This case is not about wealth or influence, it's about the well-being of 2 children who deserve to be with the parent who truly puts their needs first. The judge nodded thoughtfully, and the session was adjourned for the day. As the courtroom emptied, Andrew approached Emma, his face tight with anger. This isn't over, he hissed. Don't think for a second you've won. Emma looked at him calmly, the strength she had built over the years radiating through her. It's not about winning, Andrew, she said quietly. It's about doing what's right for our children. As he stormed away, Emma turned to her lawyer. Do you think the judge will believe them? She asked, glancing at Noah and Sophia, who were now chatting happily. I think the judge is starting to see the truth, Mr. Adewale said with a reassuring smile. And the truth is all we need. Emma nodded, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. For the first time in years, she believed she could win, not just for herself, but for her children. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet hum as everyone returned to their seats. The final moments of the custody trial had arrived, and all eyes were on the two opposing parties. Emma sat quietly beside her lawyer, Mr. Adewale, her expression calm but resolute. Across the room, Andrew leaned back in his chair, his confident smirk still in place, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes after the previous testimonies. Your Honor, Mr. Adewale began as he stood. His voice was steady, carrying an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. Before we conclude, there is one final piece of evidence that I believe will provide a complete picture of Mrs. Emma Okafor's capabilities and her ability to care for her children. Andrew raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of mild curiosity. He glanced at his lawyer, who shrugged slightly, clearly unconcerned. Emma, however, sat taller, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she prepared for what was to come. Throughout this trial, Mr. Adewale continued, Mr. Okafor has attempted to portray Mrs. Okafor as financially unstable and incapable of providing for her children. However, the reality is quite the opposite. My client is, in fact, a highly successful businesswoman with significant financial resources at her disposal. The courtroom erupted in whispers. People leaned toward each other, murmuring in disbelief. Even the judge's eyebrows rose slightly, though he quickly silenced the room with a sharp tap of his gavel. Andrew straightened in his chair, his smug expression faltering. What is this nonsense? He muttered under his breath. Ignoring him, Mr. Adewale continued. After her divorce, Mrs. Okafor rebuilt her life through hard work, resilience, and the support of trusted friends. She now holds substantial investments in real estate and technology, and her net worth places her among the most successful businesswomen in the country. He placed a thick file on the evidence table and flipped it open. Here we have documentation of Mrs. Okafor's assets, including properties in prime locations, equity in thriving tech startups, and income statements that clearly demonstrate her financial stability. Andrew's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This is completely irrelevant to the custody case. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Adewale. Thank you, Your Honor, Mr. Adewale said with a nod. He turned to Emma and gestured for her to stand. Mrs. Okafor, could you please tell the court about your journey after the divorce? Emma stood slowly, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and faced the judge. Your Honor, when my marriage ended, I had nothing. I was left with 2 young children to care for and no financial support. It was the hardest time of my life, but I refused to give up. A close family friend, Auntie Beezy, offered me an opportunity to invest in a small real estate project. I started small, learning everything I could about the business, and over time I expanded into other areas, including technology. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, her confidence shining through. I kept my success private because my focus has always been on my children. Every decision I made was for them. I wanted to ensure that Noah and Sophia would never have to struggle the way I did. The courtroom was silent as Emma finished. She glanced briefly at Andrew, whose face had turned pale. His jaw tightened, and his hands gripped the edge of the table as if to steady himself. You're lying, Andrew blurted out, his voice sharp. This is some kind of trick. The judge frowned and tapped his gavel. Mr. Okafor, you will remain silent unless addressed. Emma didn't react to Andrew's outburst. She simply turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I have worked hard to provide a stable and loving environment for my children. I may not have flaunted my success, but that doesn't mean I've been incapable. My children are my priority, and I will continue to do everything in my power to give them the life they deserve. As she sat down, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Andrew's lawyer looked flustered, flipping through his notes as if searching for a rebuttal. Andrew, on the other hand, looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by disbelief and anger. Mr. Adewale turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this revelation not only disproves Mr. Okafor's claims of financial instability, but also highlights the stark contrast between these two parents. While my client has dedicated herself to building a secure future for her children, Mr. Okafor has relied on manipulation and deceit. The choice is clear. The judge nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Adewale. This court will adjourn for deliberation. As the judge left the room, Andrew finally snapped. He leaned across the table, his voice low but venomous. You think this changes anything, Emma? You're still nothing without me. Emma met his glare with quiet strength. You've always underestimated me, Andrew, she said softly. That's your mistake, not mine. For the first time, Andrew had no response. He sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of frustration and defeat. Emma turned to her lawyer, who gave her a reassuring nod. She had fought hard to reach this moment, and for the first time in years, she felt like she had truly won. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the judge to deliver the final verdict. Emma sat at her table, her hands clasped tightly together. On one side of her was her lawyer, Mr. Adewale, calm and composed. On the other side, Andrew sat stiffly, his face a mask of forced confidence. Yet the faint twitch in his jaw betrayed his growing anxiety. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak. After reviewing the evidence, hearing the testimonies, and considering the best interests of Noah and Sophia Okafor, this court has reached a decision regarding custody. Emma's heart pounded so loudly she could hardly hear the words that followed, but she caught the most important ones. This court grants full custody to Mrs. Emma Okafor. The room erupted into murmurs. Emma sat frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Beside her, Mr. Adewale placed a firm hand on her shoulder. You did it, Emma, he said with a small smile. Andrew slammed his hand on the table, his chair screeching as he pushed it back and stood. This is outrageous, he bellowed. I provided everything for those children. I'm their father. The judge raised his gavel and banged it sharply, restoring order to the courtroom. Mr. Okafor, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Andrew hesitated but eventually sank back into his seat, his face red with fury. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something in his ear, but Andrew waved him off angrily. For the first time in years, Andrew looked small and powerless, a shadow of the man who had once loomed over Emma's life. Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the pen in front of her. She signed the final custody papers, ensuring that Noah and Sophia were now officially under her care. It felt surreal, like waking up from a long, painful dream. The judge addressed her one last time. Mrs. Okafor, I commend you for your resilience and commitment to your children. It is clear that they are in capable and loving hands. This court is adjourned. Emma stood slowly, feeling the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She turned to see Noah and Sophia being escorted into the room. Their faces lit up when they saw her. Mommy! Sophia cried, running into her arms. Noah followed, hugging her tightly. Tears streamed down Emma's face as she held them close. It's over, she whispered. We're going home. Andrew, still seated, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of anger and disbelief. His arrogance, once so unshakable, had crumbled. He stood abruptly and strode over to Emma, his voice low but laced with bitterness. This isn't over, Emma, he hissed. You think you've won, but you'll never be able to handle this without me. Emma turned to him, her expression calm but firm. Andrew, I've been handling everything without you for years. And now, I'm finally free to do it without your interference. His mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time Andrew seemed at a loss. He turned sharply and stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyer trailing behind him. Emma watched him go, feeling no anger, only a sense of finality. This chapter of her life was over. Outside the courtroom, the bright sunlight hit her face as she stepped into the fresh air with her children. Sophia held her hand tightly, while Noah walked beside her, his small chest puffed out as if he were proud of her. "Mommy, does this mean we're staying with you forever?" Noah asked, looking up at her. Emma knelt down so she could look him in the eye. "Yes, my love," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We're a team now, and nothing can take us apart." Sophia hugged her tightly again. "I'm so happy, Mommy," she whispered. Emma stood, holding each of their hands as they walked toward the car waiting for them. As they reached the steps, she paused for a moment and looked back at the courthouse. Memories of her struggles, doubts, and fears flashed through her mind. But instead of feeling pain, she felt pride. She had fought for her children, for herself, and for the life they deserved, and she had won. As they drove away, Noah and Sophia chattered excitedly about what they wanted for dinner and the fun things they could do together. Emma smiled, her heart full. This victory wasn't just about winning a custody battle. It was about reclaiming her life and proving, not just to Andrew but to herself, that she was capable of more than anyone had ever given her credit for. That evening, as she tucked Noah and Sophia into bed, Emma sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on her journey. The road had been long and filled with pain, but it had also shaped her into the woman she was now, strong, resilient, and fearless. She thought about the people who had supported her along the way, especially Auntie Beezy and Mr. Adewale. They had believed in her when she could barely believe in herself. As she closed her eyes and leaned back against the couch, a deep sense of peace settled over her. This wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a new chapter. One filled with love, hope, and the freedom to live life on her terms. For the first time in years, Emma felt truly free.